Dragon Quest. You can't talk about JRPG history without starting right here. While a few early titles technically beat it to release, Dragon Quest is the one that set the blueprint for the entire genre. Created by Yuji Horii, with character designs by Akira Toriyama and music by Koichi Sugiyama, it fused elements from Western tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons with a streamlined design made specifically for Japanese consoles. It was simple: turn-based combat, a lone hero, towns, dungeons, and a quest to defeat the Demon Lord. But that formula was so tight, it became the model every other developer studied. You can trace the DNA of Final Fantasy, Phantasy Star, Shin Megami Tensei, and even Pokemon right back to Dragon Quest. Even modern titles like Persona 5 and Elden Ring, though vastly different, owe their pacing, world building, and player progression concepts to systems Dragon Quest first popularized. Without this game lighting the fire in Japan, there's a good chance the JRPG genre wouldn't have gone global. Ys 1. Ancient Ys vanished. While Dragon Quest shaped the turn-based side of the genre, Ys showed that real-time action could work just as well. Released by Nihon Falcom, Ys 1 didn't invent the action RPG, but it made it fast, stylish, and accessible in a way that clicked with players, especially once it hit the Sega Master System, one of the first widely available ports outside Japan. Instead of menus and turn counters, you played as Adol Kristen, bump-attacking enemies in real time, while leveling up and exploring dungeons, fusing the combat freedom of Zelda with the stat-building systems of Dragon Quest. That blend of action and RPG mechanics laid the foundation for an entire subgenre that would eventually give us titles like Tales of Symphonia, Kingdom Hearts, and Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana. Today, real-time JRPGs are everywhere, and it's games like Ys that proved they could stand alongside the turn-based giants. Final Fantasy IV. Before Final Fantasy IV, most JRPGs told stories in broad strokes: good versus evil, hero versus demon lord. But Final Fantasy IV marked a turning point, the moment when character-driven storytelling took center stage in the genre. Rather than just filling your party with interchangeable avatars, Final Fantasy IV gave each character depth and purpose. Cecil isn't just a knight, he's a conflicted dark knight, wrestling with guilt and identity, eventually transforming into a paladin in one of the most symbolic class changes in RPG history. Kain, Rosa, Rydia, Edge, they all have arcs, motives, and personal stakes. You weren't just grinding levels, you were watching actual people change and grow. It was also one of the first JRPGs to use its combat system to reflect narrative stakes. Characters would leave, die, return, and even change roles in the party depending on the story. Unheard of at the time. And the plot? It threw everything at you: betrayal, redemption, long-lost family, and yes, a giant whale spaceship that takes you to the moon. Final Fantasy IV proved that JRPGs could deliver emotional storytelling on par with books or films, all while keeping players engaged through tight combat and exploration. It didn't just raise the bar, it redefined what storytelling in RPGs could be. Earthbound. When most JRPGs were set in medieval castles or sci-fi space stations, Earthbound did something unheard of. It told a story set in a quirky version of 1990s America. Instead of knights and dragons, you had baseball bats, ATMs, traffic signs, and enemies like hippies and possessed street signs. But under the weird humor and offbeat presentation was something surprisingly deep. You played as Ness, a young boy tasked with stopping an otherworldly evil. But Earthbound wasn't really about saving the world. It was about growing up. Along the way, you make friends, face fears, and deal with themes like isolation, identity, and courage. Even its final boss, a surreal, disturbing moment of abstract horror, reflects how far the game strays from typical JRPG tropes. While it flopped in the US during its initial release, Earthbound became a cult classic, especially with the rise of the internet and emulation. Today, it's considered a creative milestone, inspiring countless indie games like Undertale and becoming a permanent part of JRPG culture. Pokemon Red and Blue. When Pokemon Red and Blue launched on the Game Boy, they didn't just become a hit, they redefined what a JRPG could be for an entire generation. Pokemon made RPG mechanics simple, addictive, And, most importantly, social. Players weren't just exploring a world and leveling up creatures, they were trading, battling, and comparing teams with real life friends thanks to the link cable and dual version release. You had turn based combat, elemental types, party management, all JRPG staples, but with a kid friendly twist that was accessible without being dumbed down. Pokemon took the genre out of niche corners and launched it into global mainstream success, especially in the West. Even more impressive, it wasn't just a game, it was a cultural movement. The anime, trading cards, toys, and merchandise empire that followed made Pokemon one of the most profitable franchises in entertainment history. And it all started with two 8-bit cartridges and 151 tiny monsters. Final Fantasy VII. When Final Fantasy VII released in 1997, it didn't just raise the bar, it obliterated the ceiling. Before Final Fantasy VII, JRPGs were mostly niche outside of Japan. But with a massive marketing push, full 3D graphics, and a story that felt bigger than anything else on the market, it became the first JRPG to truly go global. Sony's partnership with Square to bring the game to PlayStation instead of Nintendo 64 was a massive shift, and the game's cinematic storytelling made it feel like a blockbuster movie. Cloud's story, his identity crisis, tragic love story, and fight against Sephiroth connected with players in a way few video game narratives ever had before. Add in pre-rendered backdrops, FMVs, an unforgettable soundtrack, and one of the most iconic villains of all time, and Final Fantasy VII became more than a game. It became a pop culture event. The success of Final Fantasy VII not only launched JRPGs into the Western mainstream, but also helped establish video games as a serious narrative art form. It paved the way for future localizations, anime-style stories in global markets, and even the rise of RPG storytelling expectations in Western studios. It's not just that people remember it, it's that the entire gaming industry changed after it. Persona 3. By the mid-2000s, JRPGs were still trying to evolve beyond medieval worlds and stoic chosen ones. Then Persona 3 came along and said, what if your party were teenagers who summoned demons by shooting themselves in the head? And somehow, it worked. Persona 3 fully embraced the genre-blending idea of mixing turn-based dungeon crawling with high school life simulation. Players didn't just fight shadows in the Midnight Tower Tartarus, they went to class, joined clubs, formed friendships, and managed their daily life like a modern slice-of-life anime. This balance between normality and darkness was what made Persona 3 feel so real. The introduction of social links changed everything. Building relationships wasn't just for flavor, it directly impacted your ability to fuse stronger personas, making your social and combat progress feel interconnected. Combined with its slick UI, hip, J-pop-inspired soundtrack, and bold use of death and existential themes, Persona 3 made JRPGs feel cool, personal, and culturally relevant again. It redefined what the genre could be, especially for younger players who wanted stories grounded in the present day. And without Persona 3 breaking that ground, we don't get Persona 4 and 5, or half of the anime-influenced RPGs that followed in its footsteps. Xenoblade Chronicles. To understand why Xenoblade Chronicles is historically important, you have to look at the JRPG landscape of the early 2000s and 10s, a time when many developers were struggling to keep up with the transition to HD consoles. While Western RPGs like Skyrim and Mass Effect were pushing open-world storytelling and cinematic scale, most JRPGs were either playing it safe or floundering to adapt. Then along came Xenoblade Chronicles, a game that not only stayed true to the genre's emotional core and character-driven narrative, but also dared to innovate where others stalled. Built for the Wii, a console not known for massive RPGs, Xenoblade delivered a genuinely expansive world, with seamless exploration, dynamic questing, and real-time strategic combat that rewarded positioning and party synergy. Its story wasn't just another JRPG anime adventure, it was a deeply philosophical journey across the bodies of fallen gods, exploring fate, free will, and the nature of existence. It felt modern without abandoning what made JRPGs special, Tight parties, emotional arcs, and mythic stakes. Xenoblade proved that JRPGs could evolve, not by copying Western design, but by reimagining themselves. And with its eventual success leading to sequels, Smash Bros. Representation, and even the resurrection of Xeno as a flagship Nintendo brand, it revitalized a corner of the genre that had been fading fast. Dark Souls. It might not look like your typical JRPG, and it certainly doesn't play like one. But make no mistake, Dark Souls is one of the most influential Japanese RPGs of all time. Developed by From Software and directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki, Dark Souls combined elements of traditional RPGs, stats, classes, equipment builds, and deep lore, with punishing combat, cryptic storytelling, and environmental world building. The result was a game that didn't just challenge the player's skill, but also their understanding of the world itself. At a time when games were becoming more guided and hand-holding, Dark Souls went the other direction. It expected you to learn, fail, explore, and grow on your own terms, and it worked. The game's impact was so massive that it spawned an entirely new subgenre, the Souls-like. But it goes even deeper than that. Dark Souls shifted the mindset of modern game design. Suddenly, difficulty wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Storytelling didn't have to be in cutscenes. It could be in item descriptions, enemy placement, and the architecture itself. It influenced everything from indie games to AAA blockbusters, and to this day, echoes of its systems and philosophy can be seen in titles like Elden Ring, Nioh, Hollow Knight, God of War Ragnarok, and even Zelda Breath of the Wild. You could argue it's the most influential JRPG of the modern era, even if most people forget it's technically one at all. Nier Automata. We wrap up this timeline of genre-defining JRPGs with a game that didn't just challenge expectations, it ripped them apart and rebuilt them into something bold, strange, and unforgettable. Nier Automata, developed by Platinum Games and published by Square Enix, is a perfect example of what happens when a JRPG stops trying to follow trends and instead fully commits to creative risk. On the surface, it looks like a sleek, fast-paced action RPG. And yes, it delivers Platinum's signature combat with style. But beneath that is a layered, emotionally devastating story about humanity, identity, and purpose, told through the eyes of androids who aren't even sure what they're fighting for. The game boldly explores philosophical questions rarely touched in games, asking what it means to be alive, what makes suffering meaningful, and whether free will is even real. But Nier Automata's brilliance isn't just in its writing, it's in its structure. The game requires multiple playthroughs to see the full story, with each route flipping your perspective on everything you thought you understood. What starts as a high-speed hack-and-slash RPG slowly morphs into a bullet hell shooter, a text adventure, and finally a deeply emotional meta-narrative that breaks the fourth wall in a way no other mainstream JRPG ever has. It's weird, it's risky, and it's unforgettable. In a time when many thought JRPGs had run out of ways to surprise us, Nier Automata proved the genre still had the power to innovate, evolve, and make us feel things we didn't expect from a video game. It's not just important, it's proof that the JRPG is still alive, still strange, and still capable of brilliance. Octopath Traveler. When Octopath Traveler launched in 2018, it wasn't just another retro-styled RPG. It was the start of a modern movement, one that would fuse nostalgic pixel art with cutting-edge visual effects, lighting, and depth of field to create what Square Enix dubbed HD 2D. The game was a spiritual successor to classics like Final Fantasy VI and Saga Frontier, but it wasn't satisfied with being a throwback. Instead, it reimagined what 2D sprites could look like on modern hardware, casting them in a world filled with dynamic shadows, particle effects, and cinematic camera work. Its layered combat system, non-linear structure, and 8-protagonist format may have divided players narratively, but the visual impact was undeniable. Octopath Traveler made retro cool again, not just as an aesthetic, but as a premium artistic choice. The response was so strong that it kicked off a full HD 2D renaissance. Remakes like Live Alive and Dragon Quest III adopted the style. New titles like Triangle Strategy expanded its storytelling depth. It gave small teams and traditionalists a fresh way to innovate within constraints, offering modern fidelity without abandoning 2D design. Octopath showed the industry that JRPGs don't have to choose between nostalgia and innovation. They can do both. It's a sign that the genre doesn't just live in the past, it thrives when the past is reimagined with purpose.